If they're not taking care of themselves, they really can't be good caregivers. And it's kind of a hard thought process to see, because a lot of people kind of get into this mode of, I'm it. I'm the only one who can do this. I'm the one that has to be doing this. And what happens is the stress levels increase, the exhaustion increases, the frustration increases, the anger increases, and if you don't take care of that, it can get out of control.
It can also begin to take a toll on the immune system. Oftentimes caregivers find that they might get an infection, whether it's an upper respiratory infection or just a cold that won't go away, because when your body is worn down, it doesn't fight as well. It's not as strong, and so it's really important that caregivers learn how to take care of themselves.
A lot of times when I get to work, people wonder why I'm so absorbed into my job and why am I so dedicated about being there. But a lot of times it's a stress reliever for me.
As far as battling negative emotions of caregiving, I'm going to give you just a few that come to mind that I've had to deal with. Disappointment, sense of abandonment, anger, scared, worried, overwhelmed, exhausted, and tired.
Do you love roller coasters? The highs and lows and twists and turns can be exhilarating, but they can also leave you sick to your stomach and holding on for dear life and just praying for it to be over. The emotions of caregiving can be like that if you don't recognize them for what they are and how to have a plan to deal with them.
Caring for a loved one is especially stressful. Caregivers suffer some tremendous health consequences, and recent data suggests 40 to 50% of family caregivers suffer from depression themselves. In addition to depression, the long-term effects of chronic care, providing that care to another adult, also leaves caregivers physically exhausted in addition to emotionally exhausted. And in addition, this is interesting, being a caregiver, recent data suggests that alone increases the possibility of the caregiver getting dementia themselves. This is most likely due to the enormous burden, exhaustion on physical, emotional, and cognitive health. This is a high burden and cost for anyone to bear. Hi, I'm Dr. Mary Ostrom, the Wesley P. Martin Professor of Alzheimer's Disease Education here at the Indiana University School of Medicine.
And I'm Orion Bell, President and CEO of Sequoia Aging and In-Home Solutions. We're your hosts for this video series, and we're glad you've joined us. Welcome to CareAware.
Grief starts with the moment somebody's diagnosed, regardless of the disease process, because you've hit a milestone. There's a loss associated with that diagnosis. You know, everything that somebody no longer can do is associated with grief. So if they've lost their ability to manage their own toileting, that's another loss. If they've lost their ability to eat on their own and you're feeding them, that's another loss. And people don't really equate that with grief. They don't look at the connection that happens with that. And then it can make the grief at the end that much harder if you haven't dealt with the grief along the way.
For caregivers, I think grief can occur on many levels and oftentimes starts before an actual death. For many people, they may be grieving the loss of a particular relationship they had. They may be grieving the loss of the ability to do many things that created their life beforehand. So in many ways, grief is an ongoing process in caregiving.
And the biggest emotion I see is when the caregiver has to face that their mom, it makes me want to cry thinking about it, their mom and dad or aunt is no longer that person they used to be, whether it's a mental or physical, disease, and them having to adjust and grieve that and become the parent themselves.
You know, that one of the emotions that caregivers often feel is grief over the loss of the loved one. They're still here, but they're not the person they were, or they're not able to do the things they once did. And sometimes that is expressed as anger over that being taken away, and that's very common.
I think anger kind of associated with guilt. You know, it's one of the five, or grief. It's one of the five parts of grief. And anger can be one of those things because you're not necessarily angry at the person. Often you're angry at the disease process, or you're angry at the losses, or you're angry at your situation. Being able to address that and take care of that is really important, because it's another one of those emotions that can build up and turn on you when you least expect it. I have caregivers who keep she has a little punching bag that she keeps in her kitchen, and so whenever she's feeling mad, she kind of goes and hits the little punching bag to kind of release some of that. Some people do physical activity. Some people use a support group. I think you have to find the way that works for you, but you've got to express it. And you've got to express it safely, because not everybody understands that anger that goes along with it. So making sure that the person you're expressing it to knows what to do with that, and maybe it's just listen to you and not really do anything about it.
And our caregivers are exhausted. Simply put, caring for a loved one 24 hours a day, 7 days a week leads to physical exhaustion, also emotional exhaustion, and many times financial exhaustion. These burdens are too much for any one family to bear.
So stress can manifest in many ways for caregivers. It can manifest through their own level of anxiety and depression. Oftentimes they find themselves crying at the drop of a hat. They may be more irritable and grouchy themselves. Sleep is often disrupted, whether that be disruption of sleeping too much or not enough, which can also dovetail into irritability, because if you're exhausted during the day, oftentimes you're more cranky with people.
Exhaustion, I think, is one of those things that can really happen to caregivers if they don't have a good plan in place, if they don't have any help, if they're trying to do everything on their own. And it can happen to you even if you do have a plan in place and have help. And thinking about and doing the things that you need to do to take care of yourself are really important. And if you're exhausted, you're no good to yourself, and you're no good to the person that you're taking care of.
It's not him that we're frustrated with, it's his equipment that we're agitated with. A lot of times it's in the middle of the night and water keeps getting in his tubes, and that's what frustrates us and gets us to our breaking point. Sometimes we want to pick up that ventilator and throw it out the window, because all you want to do is sleep, but you can't because his alarms keep going off, and it's not anything that he's doing.
We call nighttime psychological warfare. That's usually pretty much what nighttime is for us. Because even though he's dead asleep, he'll sleep right through it. But he has little sensor tubes. They're here. We'll fill up with water because he has a humidifier, which he has to stay on. And the different changing of the temperature will condense in there. And it'll set up for a false alarm. He's not really needing anything. But he'll keep beeping until you come downstairs, shake it off, hook it back together, go back to sleep, get back to sleep about half an hour, 45 minutes, do it again.
Another challenge for caregiver can be the social isolation. Sometimes a caregiver feels they can't leave the house because they're afraid to leave their loved one alone, or they don't feel there's someone else who can help provide some of the care. And that leads to an increased sense of isolation and just being alone.
When you're the caregiver for someone, your world becomes very small. You start to feel like there is no one out there who understands what you're going through. You start to feel very trapped by the caregiving situation, and that can lead to the same kinds of depression in caregivers that we see among the folks who are in need of care.
I mean, both my brother and sister live in California. They did what they could, but just for me personally, since I was here, I didn't go out really. My social life went next to nothing.
Something else you'll find, your friends will quit calling to invite you to things because they just assume you can't go to. Sometimes it's still nice to get asked though. We can usually make arrangements, but that's something else that fades away too. Is that you get asked to do less and less because people just automatically assume. And there's a lot of times where we're like, well, we could have done that. We would have liked to have done that. But you just...
Like, oh, they all went to the Pacer game. That would have been nice to go.
Yeah. So we're used to that now. When that first started happening, that was kind of a tough one to swallow, But, or you're always hosting things at your house, which gets old too, because it is easier being here. you can't expect everybody to accommodate everything you need when you go. So I always say, like, when we go somewhere, it's like the circus is in town. You know, we show up with all of our stuff and, you know, take over. And, you know, we've not gone to events over just because there's going to be so many people there. We're like, well, you must feel guilty taking up that much space because he takes up a lot of space, you know, that we need just to kind of corner out in a room so he doesn't get, you know, trampled on, or he has space to move. So we've not gone to certain events with friends, you know, and especially, you know, even family events, because we knew it was going to be packed or a lot of people, and so that's one thing too.
Caregiving can also lead to strain in the relationships within our own families. Sometimes this is due to miscommunication, misunderstanding among, you know, adult child and their parents that are caregiving, or among adult siblings. This is not unusual, and indeed I maintain that all families are a little bit dysfunctional.
How you deal with family conflicts that are internal about caring for the little, oh, that is the $1 million question. There is no right or wrong answer to that. The reason being because depending on the personalities in the family, you just have to play it by ear. Every family has dynamics where, well, not every family, but most, where one does more work, one doesn't get along, one doesn't communicate. I mean, you have all of those. And the best way, sometimes you can all sit down, and that works with some families. With other families, it's just best not to. And the reason why is because I find that with some family members, their self-interest becomes more important. Is there going to be an inheritance left for me if we bring in a caregiver and pay that person? So I think the best thing is for the most responsible person to try to communicate with everyone, but if they can't, they have to step out on their own and go ahead and pursue the best interest of that loved one.
So when there's a child with a disability in the home, oftentimes parents struggle as well, striving to balance the needs of each child. Oftentimes the sibling feels neglected because the child with a disability, or, you know, the sick kid in the family gets all the attention, has to go to all the appointments. And so, again, parents are pulled in two different directions, and oftentimes just need a heightened sense of awareness of, for the child who is normally developing, has activities, has sporting events, has musical events, you know, has a desire to have friends over, do sleepovers, that sort of thing. And again, how to coordinate all of those becomes a challenge and a negotiation.
Most of the fractures I see or I hear about in my office come as a result of poor communication. Decisions are being made and you're not engaging the whole family. I'm very lucky myself. I'm one of 6 kids. And as my mom was on her final journey, we were all conference calling. We're spread throughout the country, but we communicated all the time, and it made such a difference. And I often tell my own clients about my experiences because it made a huge difference in not only our family, but in the type of dying process my mom had. I know she felt comforted by the fact that we were all on board, we were there, we were talking to one another.
So I would not vent, but I would talk a lot about what was going on with Dad and with you know, the situation on Facebook. And my brother and sister, my sister especially, got very angry about that and just thought all that should be private and I shouldn't be sharing anything about Dad on Facebook, and it was a disgrace to him and blah, blah, blah. And that was my support group. That was, you know, I didn't have time to go out to support group or anything like that, but my friends I shared that information with, that was my support group. So that caused tension between us that we've since worked through, I think.
And so those doubts and things inside of me where I'm dealing with my own emotional internal things, let it go. Just do the best you can. And when other people disappoint you, this is my latest thing. I've only got so much energy to deal with what's going on. And if somebody disappoints me or upsets me, I don't have the energy to get upset about it. I mean, I'm human. I go, oh boy, I'm really upset about this. And then I go, I got to move past it. I can't. And then I think I have to just realize that people help as they can. And no one means any lack of help. They just aren't in a space to do things sometimes.
And many times a caregiver feels guilt. They resent being placed in the role of being a caregiver, and they'll feel guilty about that. Or they feel they're not doing enough, and they feel guilty about that. And it's important to realize that guilt doesn't have to be part of the conversation about being a caregiver.
So I've long talked with clients about the ambivalent feelings that go along with caregiving. Clients oftentimes feel guilty that they have those what are considered negative emotions. And I talk with them about that caregiving is really the balance between compassion and resentment. Compassion for your loved one who has perhaps a chronic or disabling condition that they just can't help. It's not their fault. And yet the resentment of, this isn't what I signed up for, this isn't what I was expecting, this isn't the way it was supposed to be. And so recognizing that there's that ebb and flow between emotions gives them permission and gives room for all of those emotions, as well as the guilt of I haven't done enough or I can't do enough, or again, the resentment or bitterness of sometimes not towards their loved one, but sometimes towards their relatives who they believe should be doing more. Why isn't she stepping up more? Why isn't he doing more? And so navigating all of those becomes important, as well as just acknowledging them and validating them within themselves.
And also an emotion you go through why you may need to do those things too is the guilt, because at the same time you're feeling all these emotions, you're angry. You're angry because they're not like they used to. You're angry because you have to do all of this. And so there's this guilt for even feeling like that. So you have anger, resentment, and then you have love and emotion, and you just feel crazy.
And there are many people who feel guilty if they take a break, if they go have lunch with a friend, or if they go, take a weekend away. Those are not things to be guilty about. Those are things to be proud of. And it's hard to reframe those, because what you feel like is, I'm the only one who can take care of my loved one. I'm the only one who can do this. You can do it, but it takes help. And so you can get bogged down in the guilt piece of it too. I think it also is, especially if you've got to place somebody in long-term care, if it kind of gets to that point where something happens, there's some crisis that happens, or the caregiving just becomes impossible at home, there's a ton of guilt associated with that piece of it. And some people make that promise that they're going to take care of somebody at home, and we may not be able to keep that promise, especially if some crisis happens or something bad happens.
Caregiving does not have to be all negative. We've learned that many caregivers do quite well in their caregiving role, and when we looked for what's the recipe for positive outcomes, we found that having a meaning to our roles, looking forward to our role of caregiving, and waking up each day with a positive attitude tends to result in a much more positive outcome of caregiving.
Because it's important to recognize that caregivers are making a choice. I find that some step into this role out of duty and some step into the role out of devotion. And that can be a very different feeling for them. So having them understand that, A, this is a choice, and your faith can guide you in how you want to walk this path with your loved one.
And I consider myself just so fortunate to be able to do what I did, and to be with him, the last few days, the last 2 years. He ended up dying the week after, about a week after their 59th wedding anniversary. And just 3 days before he died, he ended up having one of his last lucid moments, where we were all at the dinner table, And all of a sudden, Mom gave him a kiss, and he perked up. I said, "Wow, you're a good kisser." And she said, "Well, thank you, so are you." I said, "Well, I know I am." And I was just so glad I got to be there for that moment, you know. I mean, just of him, that sparkle in his eye, and just, you know, seeing the old dad that I remember, you know, just during that moment. And that's what you hold on to. That's what you do it for. Just because you love him. You just want to do anything you can for him.
And I find that that's the fulfilling part for me, is giving back to my parents what they gave to all of us. And they were selfless. They were. This is what Ram Dass says. In the end, we're all just walking each other home. And that's what I think caregiving's all about.
In the next video, we'll discuss the importance of respite and preventative self-care to help reduce stress.
Please join us again in our next session of Care Aware.